Today, the United States commands a massive share of global wealth and military power. But for more than a century after European explorers first crossed the Atlantic, the vast stretches of North America were almost entirely ignored. Early empires were hunting for quick, lucrative returns. The Spanish and Portuguese focused their fleets on the Caribbean and South America, extracting gold and building trading networks. They drew their lines across the southern hemisphere, leaving the northern half off their radar. When the English finally set up camps decades later, they were fighting simply to stay alive. Their first colony at Roanoke vanished without a trace. The religious groups that followed faced freezing winters, disease, and starvation on a brutal, unforgiving coast. The United States began as a desperate struggle for survival on the extreme, unwanted margins of the map, far from the center of global trade. As the colonial population multiplied, they inevitably collided with French and native forces in the West. The resulting war secured the territory for Britain, but it came with a massive financial hangover for the empire. To pay off debt, Parliament levied heavy taxes. Lacking a vote, colonists violently rejected the burden, sparking the War for Independence. But victory didn't create a unified nation. Under their first laws, the colonies fractured into 13 separate, heavily indebted states. The experiment was collapsing. Facing total ruin, the founders scrapped the original government. They wrote a new constitution that forced these independent states into a single federal system and placed George Washington at the helm to keep the fragile union intact. Independence was an immediate, severe crisis that forced a disjointed rebellion to either figure out how to govern itself or dissolve completely. Over in Europe, Napoleon desperately needed cash to fund his looming conflict with Britain. For $15 million, he signed over the entire Louisiana territory to the Americans, doubling the size of the country in a single transaction. That new space was immediately necessary. At the time, the average American family had 7 children. To find land for a rapidly multiplying population, waves of settlers packed up and pushed west across the continent. This outward pressure ignored international borders. Settlers flooded into northern Mexico, outnumbering the local population. They staged a rebellion to form the Republic of Texas, and their eventual annexation by the U.S. triggered a brutal war that stripped Mexico of its northern territories. The nation stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific by leveraging its population growth to overwhelm and extract land from distracted or weakened empires. Expanding the map brought a massive internal conflict to a boiling point. The Southern economy relied on the forced labor of millions of enslaved people. As new states joined the Union, politicians fought bitterly over whether slavery would be allowed to spread westward. Decades of compromises failed. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, the Southern slave-holding states violently separated from the Union to form their own government and protect their economic system. The ensuing Civil War pitted millions of Americans against each other. After 4 years of brutal combat, the Southern Rebellion collapsed. The Union was restored by force, and millions of enslaved people were finally freed. While the war resolved the existential threat of secession and ended slavery, the social peace remained fragile and contested. But the conflict had also forged a centralized federal authority and a massive industrial engine, a foundation that, for the first time, gave the Republic the momentum to exert influence far beyond its own shores. Emerging from the trauma of the war, the federal government began to flex its newly consolidated authority by purchasing Alaska from Russia. Then, American business interests took over the Hawaiian Islands and asked Washington for formal annexation. This forced a debate. Should the Republic stick to its tradition of avoiding foreign entanglements, or secure a strategic outpost before arrival like Germany or Japan claimed it? That hesitation vanished in the Caribbean. A mysterious explosion sank an American warship in the waters of Havana, and the resulting public outrage pushed Washington into a direct military confrontation with the Spanish Empire. The frontier at home was closed. To secure its newly built wealth, the nation had to decide whether to remain isolated or step out to protect its interests among competing global empires. The military response was overwhelming. U.S. forces swiftly dismantled the remnants of the Spanish Empire, seizing control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, formally ending the imperial project that Columbus had started. Under President Theodore Roosevelt, the country heavily invested in hard power. He built the second-largest navy on Earth, giving Washington the ability to project influence across the oceans. To maximize that naval power, Roosevelt aggressively backed the creation of Panama, securing the rights to carve a massive shipping canal through the jungle. This allowed American warships and trade vessels to seamlessly transition between the Atlantic and Pacific. By 1914, as the old powers of Europe plunged into the First World War, the United States stood apart. It had evolved into a fully industrialized, continent-spanning force. The status of a global power was not an inevitable outcome of geography, but the result of surviving a century of near-fatal ruptures and repurposing that survival into a new, outward-facing strength.